Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 158, Richard II, Sad Stories of the Death of Kings. I hope you have enjoyed the recent run of guest episodes, but now it's time to get back to Shakespeare, Jonson and their plays. I'm picking up the journey through Shakespeare with his return to the history play genre, and the start of what is now seen as a tetralogy of plays concerned with the medieval period reigns of Richard II, Henry IV and Henry V. Each play has a distinct slant on English history, which makes closely joining them a slightly uncomfortable exercise, and if Shakespeare did conceive them as a series of sequels, he was probably forced to change his tack on more than one occasion by current political circumstances and changes within the Lord Chamberlain's men. I'm going to look at each one of the plays separately and in the order in which they were written, as far as we know it. Personally, I found Richard II the most difficult of the history plays to get to grips with, but also one of the most rewarding to engage with once I had a better understanding of it. It shows Shakespeare as a playwright really starting to master his craft. It is the first play he wrote completely in verse. It includes powerful theatrical imagery, and it just oozes with daring political statements throughout. I'll start with a brief summary, as the historical politics that the play covers and the relationships within that are quite complicated. The King's uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, has been murdered. His cousin and John of Gaunt's son, Bolingbroke, accuses Thomas Mowbray of causing Gloucester's death and challenges him to a trial by combat. When Gloucester's widow demands of his brother John of Gaunt that he avenges her husband's death, Gaunt tells her that he cannot do so, as the king is implicated in the murder. Before Mowbray and Bolingbroke can fight, the king intervenes and banishes them both, Mowbray for life and Bolingbroke for 10 years, which Richard then reduces to 6 years after the pleading of John of Gaunt. Gaunt is ill and accuses the king of poor stewardship of the country, laying a burden of tax on the people and showing too much generosity with land grants to his favourites. After Gaunt has retired to his estates, the king hears that he is indeed near death and rushes to meet him while hoping that he dies soon so that his lands can be sequestered and fund the king's proposed expedition to subdue the Irish, thus denying Bolingbroke his inheritance. After Gaunt's death, Richard departs for Ireland, leaving his uncle, the Duke of York, to govern in his name. The Duke of Northumberland reveals to some dissatisfied lords that Bolingbroke has returned to England at the head of an army. When Bolingbroke meets with York, he insists that he has only returned to claim his inheritance, not to start a rebellion. However, when his men capture the king's favourites Bushy and Green, he acts as judge and jury and has them executed. Men begin to gather around him. Richard returns from Ireland to discover the Welsh troops that were to meet him have disbanded, and that many in the country are rising against him and flocking to Bolingbroke's banner. The opposing sides meet at Flint Castle, and Bolingbroke only asks for his banishment to be annulled and his lands returned to him. Richard agrees, but is then persuaded to abdicate in the face of the uprising in the country. Bolingbroke makes preparations for his coronation as King Henry IV. York discovers that his son, O'Merle, is involved in a plot to assassinate the new king and restore Richard to the throne. In the face of his parents' protests, O'Merle confesses the plot to King Henry, who listens to the pleadings of the Duchess of York and pardons him. Richard is taken to Pontefract Castle and murdered by an ambitious lord. Henry is trying to find his wayward son, who is shirking from his new responsibilities by spending his time in the taverns, when he hears that all rebellion against him has been quashed and the leaders executed. Just then, Richard's body is dragged before him, and, claiming that he never wanted the death of the ex-king, he promises to undertake a pilgrimage to the Holy Land to purge his sins. The earliest record of a performance of Richard II is from the 9th of December 1595, which was a private performance at the home of Edward Hoby, a diplomat and senior courtier, first to Elizabeth, who he was related to by marriage, and then to James. With no evidence of earlier public performances, 1595 is therefore the best we can do for dating the composition of the play. However, there must have been many unrecorded performances, as by mid-1597 the play was registered at the Stationers' Company for publication. A first quarto edition appeared a few months later, and in a further indication of the play's popularity, 2 further quarto editions were published in 1598. This is the only time that 3 editions of a Shakespeare play appeared in print within 2 years. Further quarto editions were published in 1608 and 1615, before the play took its place in the 1623 First Folio. These multiple early printings are particularly interesting, as the printed text varies in each case, and most significantly, the first 3 quarto editions do not include the scene where Richard is deposed. The 4th quarto includes a shortened version of that scene, and the First Folio presents the extended version, which is the one that you would normally see in performance today. Although there is no first-hand reasoning for these changes, it's assumed that the early quartos were subject to censorship by the Master of the Revels, because of the sensitivities during Elizabeth's reign around the idea of the deposing of a monarch or of abdication. Possibly the printers knew the way the land lay and self-centred the proofs before Sir Edward Tilney got anywhere near them. By the time the later quartos and the First Folio were published, James was secure on the throne and with a decent line of succession apparently in place, so the scene could be safely added back into the play. Shakespeare's major source material is once again Holinshed's Chronicles of England and Edward Hall's The Union of 2 Illustrious Families of Lancaster and York. A further source may be an anonymous play which deals with the events that led up to the start of Shakespeare's play. Sometimes known as the first part of Richard II, and more commonly now as Thomas of Woodstock, referring to the Duke of Gloucester, it has also been suggested that this could itself be an early Shakespeare play, or one that he contributed to as a collaboration. As we have already seen, Shakespeare's plays always include contemporary references, but none are more relevant to the specifics of their time than Richard II, a fact that led the play into significant controversy. Even by the time of its first performance, questions about the succession, given Elizabeth's lack of progeny, were very much of the moment. Questions that were complicated by the fact that not only was it treasonous to discuss the matter, but it took on a religious dimension as for many, the succession presented an opportunity to return the monarchy, and therefore the country, to Catholicism. A play that recounted the demise of a weak king without issue, and his replacement by a strong leader who already had a son, could easily be seen as advancing the discussion about the succession to an unacceptable degree, and hence at least one reason for censorship that I've already mentioned. We don't know how Shakespeare took to the act of censorship on his play. The removal of that particular scene certainly weakens the dramatic tension of the play, so he can't have been happy. But it's difficult to imagine that he was not at least aware of the possibility of censorship as he was writing it. Whatever his feelings, and maybe protestations, he was persuaded and perhaps relieved that the play was performed even in an emasculated form. A decent take at the box office probably eased things along, but little did the players realise that this particular play would lead them into some more problems a few years later. Now, I have recounted this episode before when I talked about the life and times of Shakespeare's fellow player and sharer Augustine Phillips at the end of Season 5, but it's such a central episode to the history of this play that I am going to retell it briefly here. In 1601, the Earl of Essex, a distant cousin of the Queen who had spent his life at court and in the army, and at times had been a favourite of the Queen's, had hit an all-time low in his relations at court. Although popular with the ordinary people, his brash and sometimes disrespectful behaviour had alienated him from many of the rich and powerful. It was said that on one occasion he was so forthright in his speech to the Queen that she slapped him across the face, and in response he half drew his sword. He was certainly lucky to have survived such an incident with his life. In the military, he served against Spain with distinction, but then led an inconclusive mission to Ireland, where his command was judged to be at fault. He dithered his way around the country without decisive engagements, and wasted the funds and the men provided before agreeing a truce that had not been approved in London. On his return, which had not been sanctioned by the Queen, he had to face a trial for his behaviour. His life was spared, But his movements were curtailed, and many of his monopoly concessions that had been granted to him and which were the main source of his income were removed from his control. As he became steadily more disappointed with the Queen and her court, he planned a coup, gathering his own supporters and weapons in his house on the Strand in London, close to Westminster. On the 2nd of February, some of his supporters went to the Globe Theatre and asked the players for a special performance of Richard II. There was nothing unusual in representatives of a high member of the court asking for a special performance, but the players were no doubt aware that the choice was controversial. An agreement to present the play was secured, but at an increased fee, an additional 40 shillings, which is something like £500 in today's terms. As it turned out, things were getting ahead of Essex. The same day, the Privy Council called on him to attend them, and he refused, making the Council fully aware of the seriousness of the situation. Having lost the element of surprise, Essex knew that he had to move quickly if he were to have any hope of success. The next morning, messengers from the Queen were taken hostage, and he marched with about 200 men into the city, expecting many of the population to join him. But the Privy Council had got word to the Lord Mayor declaring Essex a traitor, a word that had some very serious implications for anyone who was in any way connected with the instigator. The expected crowds failed to appear, and many of his supporters simply melted away before they could be recognised. Essex and his remaining men returned to Essex House, hoping to regroup, but they found that their hostages had gone and they were soon under siege by men loyal to the Queen. By evening, it was all over, and Essex and his men were under arrest. He and the leaders were all tried for treason and beheaded or hung 2 weeks later. In the days following the attempted coup, in what must have been a very tense atmosphere in London, the council took to examining all of those who might have been involved. Augustine Phillips was examined by 2 justices appointed by the council for the task. They wrote up the examination for the official record, where they said, "The examination of Augustine Phillips, servant unto the Lord Chamberlain, and one of his players, taken on the 18th of February, 1601, under oath. That Friday last, or Thursday, Sir Charles Percy, Sir Jocelyn Percy, and the Lord Mounteagle, with some 3 or more, spoke to some of the players in the presence of this examinate, to have the play of the deposing and the killing of King Richard II to be played on Saturday next, promising them 40 shillings more than their ordinary to play it. Where this examinate and his fellows were determined to have played some other play, holding that the play of King Richard to be so old and so long out of use, that they should have small or no company at it. But at their request, this examinate and his fellows were content to play it on the Saturday, and have their 40 shillings more than their ordinary for it, and so played it accordingly." By then the play was about 6 years old, which Phillips suggests may have been very old and of little interest. Perhaps he was just trying to stress that the choice of this particular play was not the choice of the players. The fact that Phillips was called to testify and not Shakespeare as the author of the play or Burbage as the lead actor might indicate that Phillips had some role in the management of the Globe. His testimony seems to focus on the money paid for the performance, so perhaps he was seen as a representative who could talk to the finances of the situation. Whatever the case, his testimony seems to have convinced the council that the players' involvement was innocent, and no further action was taken. In fact, the Lord Chamberlain's men performed for the Queen later that month, the night before Essex and his co-conspirators were executed. This story is just a small side note to the Essex Rebellion, but I think it does illustrate just how influential the performance of plays was considered to be at the time. The Privy Council clearly thought that the presenting of this play could at least incite Londoners to significant action. Theatre has rarely, if ever, had such power since. The play of the life and death of Richard II, set in 1398, focuses on just the last 2 years of Richard's reign, and it is considered to be one of Shakespeare's more accurate depictions of English history. Henry Bolingbroke and the Duke of Norfolk were banished over the murder of the Duke of Gloucester, as shown in the opening scenes of the play, and it is likely that Richard was implicated in that murder. Richard's largesse amongst his supporters and spending on his own pet projects, like that military operation in Ireland, while fleecing the nobility for funding, were seen at the time as grossly unfair. In total, Richard sequestered about a third of the nobility's wealth during his reign, which led to latent and active dislike of him and his position as an absolute monarch. Shakespeare's Richard is particularly arbitrary in his actions, seizing, it seems, on whatever action takes his fancy in the moment. The return from Ireland to find Bolingbroke breaking his banishment and the country turning against the king is also historically accurate. Richard had heavily taxed the common people, so there was a significant groundswell of support for Bolingbroke as a representative of widespread grievances. Bolingbroke did indeed initially claim only to be returning to regain his rightful inheritance. The abdication happened at Flint Castle, and Richard was held in the Tower of London. At this point, Bolingbroke had not made his full intentions clear, possibly because a strategy about his right to inherit the crown was still being worked out. The official record states that Richard gave up his crown willingly, others suggest that he fought for his right to kingship. He was formally deposed by Parliament by a unanimous vote on the 1st of October 1399. Bolingbroke, now Henry IV, let Richard live in captivity until a plot to rescue him was discovered, at which point he was allowed to starve to death, with Henry's tacit or explicit agreement. His body was displayed in St Paul's Cathedral before burial in an attempt to quash any rumours of his continued existence and the possibility of future pretenders to the throne claiming to be him. That didn't quite work, and as Shakespeare would go on to recount, questions of Henry's legitimacy haunted his reign. While retaining these historical facts, Shakespeare still manages to give both Richard and Bolingbroke a huge dramatic arc to travel through the course of the play, and their arcs are, by the nature of events, inexorably linked. The basic arc of the fall of the king, titled as a tragedy in an early quarto printing, is matched and balanced by the rise of Bolingbroke, but is made more dramatically complex by the way Richard becomes a more sympathetic character towards the end of the play as he sees power slipping away from him. It is a tragedy in the sense that this loss of power is because of his own poor decisions, until his fall becomes inevitable. But Bolingbroke is ruthless, and there is always a question mark over the honesty of his position. Things come to a head in one of Shakespeare's most powerful scenes, as the two men literally hold the crown between them, a hugely theatrical moment. Another dramatist's tool that Shakespeare uses powerfully in the play is representing the political turmoil and the issues affecting the country within the personal relationships of the characters. The political conflicts are familial throughout the play, not just the relationship of Gaunt and Bolingbroke to the king, but in the demands of the recently widowed Duchess of Gloucester, the concerns of the Queen, and the pleas of the Duchess of York for the life of her son. Once again in Shakespeare, we have female roles which, although relatively small and not crucial to the plot, are critical to the themes of the play and make impassioned argument for their beliefs. All three women are given a strong presence through their rhetorical skills and cogent arguments. The older women in particular are persuasive, if not always successful, in their arguments that underlie the immediate drama. As the Duchess of Gloucester says to her brother-in-law, John of Gaunt, when she questions how inaction against a tyrant can be anything other than complicity. In suffering thus thy brother to be slaughtered, thou showest the naked pathway to thy life, teaching stern murder how to butcher thee. That which in mean men we entitle patience is pale cold cowardice in noble breasts. What shall I say? To safeguard thy own life, the best way is to revenge my Gloucester's death. When O'Merle is caught plotting against the new king by his father, it is his mother, the Duchess of York, who pleads for his life, batting off the objections of her husband by stressing his insincerity and arguing that if he cannot love his son enough to save his life, then how can he love anyone enough to be truly loyal to them, including the king? As Henry repeatedly asks her to stand, she refuses, grinding down his resolve until he formally grants the pardon. The scene verges on the comic with the back and forth of the wordplay, but remains poignant as the Duchess bravely defies her husband and the king on her knees. Nay, do not say stand up. Say pardon first, and afterwards stand up. And if I were thy nurse, thy tongue to teach, pardon should be the first word of thy speech. I never longed to hear the word till now. Say pardon, king. Let pity teach thee how. The word is short, but not so short as sweet. No word like pardon for king's mouth so meet. And as for the Queen, she plays little part in the politics of the play, in keeping with the role of a queen at the time. She is perhaps the most invented character in the play and the most significant historical anomaly. At the time of these events, Queen Isabel was just 10 years old, having been married to Richard, who was by then a widower and 22 years her senior, at the age of 7. The agreement with her father, Charles VI of France, was that the marriage would not be consummated until she reached the age of 12, which was in line with the custom and practice of the time. Despite the age difference, Richard and Isabel appear to have had a good platonic relationship. On his death, before she was 12, Henry tried to marry her to his son, but she refused and made a public show of mourning Richard. Eventually, she was returned to France, although Henry managed not to return the generous dowry that had come with her. She married again for dynastic purposes and died in childbirth, aged just 19. In the play, where she is portrayed as a young woman, she is used to show how a woman can have a true sense of the course of events, even when she cannot influence them. Her suggestion to one of Richard's friends that things could end badly are dismissed, and he compares her view to a perspective glass that alters the reality of true things. However, in the end, she is proved right, and her loyal and loving behaviour towards her husband is exemplary. She also takes her place in a very Shakespearean scene where the gardeners contemplate the state of the nation. On the face of it, the scene is there for some light relief, but as we've already seen in the other history plays, the lowly characters are often as important and insightful in Shakespeare's hands as any of the kings or lords, and this scene is another great example. After several scenes filled with the arguments of kings and nobles, here we have the Queen overhearing the opinions of some lowly gardeners, perhaps a direct appeal to the groundlings in the audience. But their words are thoughtful and salient to the play. For example, in the following lines, the apricots represent Richard or his actions, and the tree represents the kingdom, when the gardener tells the serving man to "Go, bind thou up young dangling apricots, which, like unruly children, make their sire stoop with oppression of their prodigal weight." And the response extends the analogy to describe the deplorable state of the kingdom and the hopelessness of the common people. Why should we, in the compass of a pale, keep law and form and due proportion, showing as in a model our firm estate? When our sea-walled garden, the whole land, is full of weeds, her fairest flowers choked up, her fruit trees all unpruned, her hedges ruined, her knots disordered, and her wholesome herbs swarming with caterpillars. And so it continues, until the previously hidden Queen intervenes and forces the gardeners to tell her more. She realises how bad things are for the king and the realm, and she concludes, "Nimble mischance, thou art so light of foot, doth not thy embrace belong to me, and am I last that knows it? Oh, thou thinkest to serve me last, when I may longest keep thy sorrow in my breast. Come, ladies, go to meet at London, London's king in woe. What, was I born to this, that my sad look should grace the trumpet of great Bolingbroke? Gardener, for telling me the news of woe, pray God the plants thou graftest may never grow." Dark times, indeed. I mentioned that the play is unusually entirely in verse. One of the functions of that verse is to draw some clear distinctions between Richard and Bolingbroke. There is more here than the simple social distinctions made through verse forms or prose that are found in most of the other plays. The king and Bolingbroke are both of the nobility, and in another play would have spoken in very similar verse. But here, the king uses extended metaphor and generally rather ornate language that is distinctly different from Bolingbroke's more direct, plain language, often delivered in blank, unrhymed verse. The difference speaks to Richard's obsession with the symbols and regalia of kingship, and as to how he is largely a passive character, reflecting on events rather than leading them. By contrast, Bolingbroke is strikingly forthright and active. The language difference also helps to set Richard apart from the world more generally, to make him seem in an extreme reading as semi-divine, which then plays into the interpretation of him later in the play as a persecuted Christ-like figure. And some productions have leaned into this aspect of the character. And while on the use of verse, I think it's also worth noting that it makes Richard II perhaps the most eloquent of the early plays, and as one of only 4 plays written entirely in verse, and probably the earliest, I wonder if this was something of a dramatic exercise by Shakespeare to see if works entirely in verse could work in the contemporary theatre, and supersede the earlier examples that must have started to look stilted and old-fashioned, and maybe too intellectual for public theatre, works such as Gorboduc and Marlowe's 2 Tamburlaine plays. If we think of Shakespeare as a dramatist exploring the possibilities of the form, then Richard II is an important example of how a new verse form play could work. Although Shakespeare usually opted for a mix of verse and prose in his plays, he did return to the entire verse form for later history plays, perhaps finding that this particular genre was best suited to verse for the creation of ambience and the distancing from the contemporary that only verse could provide. Questions about the doctrine of the divine rights of kings is central to the play and to Richard's position, and it's been suggested that this places him firmly as a medieval king, with Bolingbroke representing a new type of ruler, one who succeeds through intellect, political acuity, and the ability to speak to the concerns of the common people. It's difficult to see that this would have been played up to in the Elizabethan period, where the Queen was still believed to have a divine right, and even persuading the Queen that she should listen to the common people more closely would have been a tricky position to take. There are many views on the character of Richard, but they can be boiled down more or less into 2 camps, which centre on the question of how performative Richard is being. Does he really believe his divine right, or is he mocking the concept by his close to irrational behaviour? His litany of bad decisions has led some commentators to feel that, as a whole, the play is satirising the concept of the divine right of kings. Richard, we could argue, sincerely believes in his right, and that all the bad actions of the play are thanks to the actions of traitors. Because of his divine right, he equates treachery with blasphemy. Is Richard just an ill-equipped fool who performs the role of a king to the best of his poor abilities? Richard is certainly performative. When he is on stage, he takes control in a way that Bolingbroke, at least in this play, never really does, and at times his lines and actions even get a laugh from the audience and appear to play up to them as much as to his courtiers. But is that precisely because his inept abilities are pretty obvious to all? Or perhaps he is sincere, and Shakespeare is showing us the type of king that is both all-powerful and yet can be weak at the same time. In that sense, Richard is a very medieval king, and one that Shakespeare is unequivocally critical of. Richard is a tragic figure, but one of his own making. Perhaps if Shakespeare was writing with a message to Elizabeth in mind, it was that for all of her divine right, it should be used wisely for the good of the realm. Gaunt, near his deathbed, points out what is at stake. This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature of herself against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in a silver sea which serves as the office of a wall or as a moat defensive to a house. Against the envy of less happier lands, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England. And if that did not get the groundlings rooting for the nobles, I'm not sure what would have. Their sympathies must have turned back a little to Richard by the end of the play, as Henry never becomes truly likeable or trustworthy, but cleverly Shakespeare still brings back some balance by making an early mention of Henry's son, the would-be Henry V, the main actor in the most recent high point of English success in France and still a source of national pride. Bolingbroke's arc may not be as satisfying as Richard's, but then we are only 1/3 of the way through his story. The play ends, not with a cliffhanger exactly, but surely with a nod to what is to come. Bolingbroke tries to maintain his show of a pious position, apparently regretting the death of the king, saying, "Lords, I protest my soul is full of woe, that blood should sprinkle me and make me grow. Come mourn with me for what I do lament, and put on sullen black incontinent. I'll make a voyage to the Holy Land, to wash this blood off my guilty hand. March sadly after, grace my mornings here in weeping, after this untimely bier." We are left to decide if we should take that at face value or not. Henry was coming to power in the face of turmoil, issues he would face in Shakespeare's next segment of the story, and had already had Richard's supporters executed. He has a ruthless aspect to him that Richard lacked. This is no clear-cut ending where good triumphs, but a segment of a complex process. Perhaps for dramatic purposes, that is because this play was conceived as Richard's story, and the future for Henry is uncertain. The question seems to hang, will Henry be a Machiavellian king who will appear pious but scheme and plot in the background, or will he be true to the ideals of kingship that are represented in his promise to perform pilgrimage? The little evidence we have suggests that Richard II was revived at intervals, with first mention of another performance at the rebuilt Globe in 1631. After the Restoration it was revived again, but remained a difficult play to stage for the same political reasons. An adaptation by Nahum Tate in 1680, where the play was renamed The Sicilian Usurper, the characters made Italian, Bolingbroke shown as a caricature of one of Charles II's popular enemies, and Richard portrayed as a martyr, was banned after just 2 performances. Later 17th century adaptations removed much of the politics and inserted love stories for some characters. Hence, they weren't banned, but also they didn't survive long in the repertoire. Following a 1798 revival of the original play, it only became truly popular again in the later 19th century, when the actor-managers of the time took on the role. It was John Gielgud's performance through the 1920s that established Richard as a major Shakespearean role, and with productions changing their emphasis for different political times, the play has remained popular ever since. The resonance of the play and its questions about the nature of power and leadership have, it seems, never been more striking than they are today. Recent television and stage versions do indeed continue to hold a mirror up to nature. The contemporary relevance of Richard II was clear even before Essex tried to get his hands on it. Elizabeth, advancing in age and childless, with a succession crisis looming, had already been compared to Richard II. She had enacted heavy taxation at the end of the 1590s, and her agreement to the execution of Mary Queen of Scots was seen as an act of tyranny by many, and to them the parallels were obvious. This was a brave play for a dramatist to pen at the time, and for the players to stage. Despite the censorship, and with particular thanks to Hemmings and Condell for restoring the missing passages to the first folio, the play remains full of strong political argument for all times. Next time, we will be taking a trip to Italy, with a look at a performing couple who embraced things that we might consider rather modern, like marketing and celebrity. And then, following that, it's back to Shakespeare and medieval history with one of his lesser performed history plays, King John. In the meantime, if you've not done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky to keep up to date with new episodes and other related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.